Sorry, I can also go back.
It's okay.
There we go.
Just
Okay,
wanted to make sure
cool.
that the recording's happening. Yes.
Got it. So this is kind of shortly what we'll discuss today. So I'll give a brief introduction about myself. Then we'll run through some of the basics about employee resource groups, or ERGs, as you'll hear me call them throughout this presentation. I'll also walk you through some of the benefits of having employee resource groups or being involved with them. This is all my own perspective. It's not anything scientific, but I think that there's a lot to be said about the work that employee resource groups do. And then we'll kind of end with where we go from here. And I'll make sure to show you the final slide, which is just a list of links that I personally look to whenever I am looking for some inspiration or information about employee resource groups and diversity and inclusion more generally. So, brief introduction about me. As Charlotta mentioned, I'm originally from Chicago, though I lived in Helsinki for almost 9 years before I made the move to Amsterdam last year. I originally moved to Finland to do my master's. To be honest, was never expecting to stay in Finland just because I wasn't sure if I'd be able to find a job, but then found myself working in tech and specifically in HR and recruiting. I did my master's in sociology with a specific focus on cultural diversity, and I wrote my master's thesis about representation in advertising. I've also worked with various NGOs, including Anti-Racist Forum, which I co-founded and it is still in operation today. That really informed a lot of the work that I have done in my career, both professionally and then also on a personal level. I also was a volunteer with SETA, which is the biggest LGBTQ+ organization in Finland. And as you can see here, worked for a few different companies, have seen both the kind of early stage startup phase, but then also large established companies like Zalando. Most of my experience that I'll be speaking about today was informed by my time at Unity, which is where I worked prior to moving to the Netherlands. I was also the co-chair of our LGBTQ+ employee resource group. So basically saw the group through to the very beginning stages, all the way to then kind of being in a place where we could really influence company policy and so forth as well. In terms of diversity and inclusion, I have kind of 4 guiding principles that inform my own philosophy. As many of you probably know, here in this group, there is no done with inclusion work. It's ever evolving. We can continue to work and make sure that we're doing the best that we can for other people and our communities in general. I tend to have a very people-first view. This is something that I feel very passionate about, just in terms of making sure that everyone's perspectives are considered and that we're really kind of taking the best steps we can to improve things for everyone involved. With inclusion work, as many of you might know as well, patience is key. Change takes a lot of time, it takes persistence, it takes energy. But with that as well, I really believe that we should celebrate our wins. Sometimes progress might feel like pushing a boulder up a mountain, but even that small step that you might take one day is something that sets you on the right path to bigger changes down the line. Now, in terms of the basics, many of you may know what employee resource groups are already. If you don't, I'll kind of quickly run through what they are. So employee resource groups, or ERGs, may also be called other things in different companies or groups. They may be called affinity groups. They might be called an employee network or something else along those lines. ERGs are typically voluntary, though sometimes also compensated in an ideal world, I would say, and are made up of and led by people with shared identities or a vested interest in supporting such groups, such as allies, and also focused on creating a more inclusive workplace. And we'll kind of walk through what a more inclusive workplace could look like, but this could be anything, simple, like things like our overall benefits, but could also include things like recruiting and other activities. ERGs can also play a strategic role in the evolution of company culture and can impact everything from your initial hiring process once you're hired through to the entire employer experience. And ultimately, I firmly believe, at least, ERGs can make your company a more inclusive and welcoming place to work. These are things that I think anyone who is involved with employee resource groups would likely attest to. But if you're also just starting out and kind of wondering, this is kind of a high level of some things that you can expect. And in terms of what sort of groups there are kind of some common groups that the companies have, but it is really dependent upon employee makeup. Where are your employees based? How many employees do you have? Are you distributed across different geographic or nationalistic locations? Even within one country, there might be very different needs in terms of an employee resource group. But some very common groups are groups focused on Black employees, Asian employees, Latinx employees, LGBTQIA+ employees, and the other groups listed here, though this is by no means an exhaustive list. So if there is a need, this is something that, hopefully this presentation will help you understand ways that you can either start a group or join an existing group at your workplace. ERGs are often employee initiated and their makeup may change over time. Some groups might start pretty small and then come to include allies and other people who are passionate about a specific group or their needs. And also one thing that I'd call out here is that many companies also have DEI teams who support ERG work and initiatives. And oftentimes ERG work is very tangibly interesting to leadership and HR teams. DEI teams are really helpful in that they're kind of written into the company framework in terms of having a salaried position. It's someone's actual job to make sure that the ERGs succeed, and also to make sure that they're consistent and that they're treated fairly. Also things like budgeting and so forth, which can be quite useful. Now, in terms of the benefits of ERGs, there are a number of different things that I could mention here, but I'll start with some simple ones. In general, ERGs create spaces for employees to build relationships and also opportunities. Oh, my apologies if you can hear my dog in the background. And also opportunities for things like targeted professional development for historically underrepresented and marginalized groups. They also kind of bolster specific expertise in their group struggles, but also successes and attitudes and opinions about everything from benefits to global current events. There's a lot happening in the world these days, so kind of staying on top of everything that impacts a particular group is often best done by the groups themselves. And ERGs can also be strategic partners for the business, both in terms of HR matters, but also things like recruiting and employer branding, employer retention, and an organization's engagement with their customers and surrounding communities. I've seen kind of an uptick, at least in my experience, with different customer bases who, as part of their vetting process, might actually ask companies about, do you have a diversity and inclusion team? Do you have some sort of resource that we can actually look at to make sure that, by taking your product into use, that it aligns with our company values? So there's a kind of shifting goalpost there, but I think it's a pretty great initiative on both part of the company, but then also the customers as well. And in my time co-leading Unity's LGBTQ+ employee resource group, I also gained skills that I would not have otherwise been able to develop in my role as a recruiter. This isn't to say that my role is not interesting or challenging, but also that I had a very specific business objective in terms of being a recruiter. I was meant to hire people, build teams, and so forth, but I wasn't really having an impact in the way that I did with my employee resource group work. One of the things that was pretty key, and this is something that, if you're in a role and you would like to eventually be some sort of people leader, it's a great opportunity for you to get more leadership experience. I was one of the faces of the employee resource group for the entire organization. I saw Unity grow from around 2,500 employees to over 7,000 in my time there. And then I also got to interact with senior leaders throughout the company, both in terms of our executive sponsors, but then also other people with an interest in making sure that Unity was a more inclusive place to work. I also got experience with things like budgeting. So this is something that I think most employee resource groups would love to have a budget component. We are very lucky to have some budget. And what we did was worked to build a budget around our events and initiatives, make sure that we could scale that up as needed, and also that we strategically used all of our budget to make a case for more budget in the future. We also had a strategic business partnership role. Our ERG leadership team advised the business on things related to our Pride activities, for example, which were both kind of internal and external events. But on a personal level, I also advised on, for example, benefits in certain countries here in the EMEA market, specifically around trans-inclusive healthcare as one specific example. And then lastly, building relationships. So, I worked with a lot of people in my role as a recruiter. I think that's probably unsurprising to those of you in the field, but I got to work with many more people than I probably would have otherwise, including other ERG leads. Unity now has 9 ERGs, so that's a lot of different leads to potentially partnership with, different HR team members, depending on the needs of our employee resource group, but then also other initiatives. Recruiting, of course, but also from a diversity and inclusion standpoint, and then also other business areas, things like procurement. I got to learn how the procurement process worked at Unity. And in general, ways to kind of further the ERG's mission and also to build strong ways of working between and amongst various ERGs as well. And this slide is specifically geared towards employer branding because I believe diversity and inclusion can inform pretty much every aspect of employer branding. Most of these also overlap with recruiting, but I've kind of broken this down into external and internal categories, but then also a hybrid of both. So, if you think about an employee resource group as a potential marketing vehicle, for instance, you can include elements on the career site or other external job boards. You can make sure that you're assessing candidate experience surveys to understand how not only is your interview process, but also is your interview process inclusive enough for your candidates' needs. It can influence how you write sourcing outreach to candidates. What sort of things are interesting to various groups? And then, of course, you can also, if you have a company blog or any other sort of external communications, and this could be on LinkedIn or elsewhere, the ERG can inform both content, but then also the ways that you structure that content. In terms of kind of the internal piece, employee surveys. So, how happy are your employees? Are they engaged? Are they able to feel like their whole selves at work? Performance and reward cycles, and this is something that I'll talk about a bit later, but is ERG experience recognized as part of these cycles? Is it rewarded? What does that look like for your company? Internal mobility is also a huge one here. So, if you're part of a team and maybe you want to try something new, or maybe you actually have a team where you don't feel safe as a member of an underrepresented group, leveraging an ERG can be a great way to make sure that you're capitalizing on all of the network that you've built as part of your group. I've kind of alluded to this already as well, but also benefits. Are your benefits inclusive enough for your team? And then hybrids. So, employee stories are really great pieces of content for employer branding. They also don't have to be done in some sort of formalized manner. Anyone's LinkedIn profiles is a great way to do personal branding as well, and kind of speaks volumes about how an employee feels about their role at a company. Company values as well. This is something that candidates might see on your career site, but then also might inform decisions that the company makes about a multitude of things. Whether I think during COVID we saw a huge change in terms of how business travel is handled. For example, is that related to company values? Is it something that can be communicated externally as well? Things like the employee referral program. Another great way. Oftentimes we see that referrals come from people similar to the referrer, but that can also be leveraged in a positive way by people who might be part of ERGs, who might be able to speak to the psychological and emotional safety of a particular company. And then, of course, events. So, hiring fairs, but it could also be meetups, could be, chats like this one here today. And then some other areas where ERGs can have an impact as well. So if you think of the entire suite of tools that you use as a company, are your systems inclusive of things like pronouns and gender identity? Do you have to fill out some sort of form for insurance purposes? Are there other things that you use on a daily basis that you have noticed might have a potential to be made more inclusive somehow? Again, are your benefits inclusive? We noticed at Unity, at least, that our benefits varied pretty drastically between our countries where we had offices. So that was something that we tried to provide commentary on and help inform our HR team about what we were seeing as an ERG. Policy. Do company policies meet the needs of your group? Do they protect the needs of your group? Are they discriminating against certain parts of your population? ERGs can comment on these things. If there's a new policy that will be rolled out, by having that kind of level of trust with HR teams, you can also potentially be able to comment before a policy is made official. This is one thing that we were able to kind of comment on at Unity in terms of remote working and some other things, not only with my ERG, but other ERGs as well. Compliance. Do compliance and security trainings account for your group's needs and nuances? Oftentimes there are things like sexual harassment trainings, but also information security trainings. Sometimes these might be handled by a third-party vendor. So ERGs can be looped in to kind of do a pre-assessment before something is rolled out to the whole company. I've heard a multitude of stories specifically about various trainings being a bit, let's say, outdated in terms of the trans experience, making sure that terminology is up to date, that people understand the nuances of identity, and that they're written into these trainings can help make sure that something as straightforward or seemingly straightforward as compliance training also accounts for your group's needs and helps to build more understanding across the company. Procurement. Do your company's customers have procurement processes that include DEI expectations? Are there different expectations for procurement in terms of budget, or if you need to order, I don't know, some sort of giveaway for a fair or some sort of career event? ERGs can have an impact on these things as well. Also in terms of different t-shirts or other items that display the ERG's logo proudly can be a great way to kind of build that camaraderie across the company. Lastly, community. Does your company do community outreach? Are you involved outside of your community? Many companies have some sort of donation platform or donation matching kind of platform or process. This is a great way to kind of loop in your ERG work. One thing that we did at Unity, which was quite interesting, is using our kind of donation matching for specific events. We planned a few events that were centered around this. Also just kind of looking at different ways that you can volunteer your time and then also track that. We use a tool called Benevity, but I also know that there are other tools out there as well. So we talked a little bit about the basics of ERGs. We have talked a little bit about the benefits. Again, these are just my thoughts and opinions based on my own experience. But let's talk a little bit about where we can go from here. So no matter where your company is in their DEI journey, I firmly believe ERGs can benefit your organization and its employees. There's no better time to start than now. It's never too late to start getting involved with ERGs and inclusion work, in my opinion. If your organization already has ERGs, great. Find out how you can get involved. Usually companies have ways that you can find information on their intranets. Oftentimes, there are set processes to do this so that it's pretty clear and straightforward. And usually there's very little expectation in terms of joining. You can join, get involved, see if this is something that you're able to dedicate time to, and then find your way from there. If you're in kind of the second group, which would be starting from scratch in terms of an employee resource group program or diversity and inclusion efforts in general, the best way that I think you could do this is by finding other people who are interested in it. And this presentation will also be shareable after this. So there's a link here to my former colleague, Sarah Cordivano's blog, where she lists kind of some basic steps in terms of how to start an ERG. Very pragmatic, very practical. Some of the things are pretty straightforward, like finding your people, but then also maybe adding some more structure and things like that as well. One other recommendation I'd have is enter with an open mind. Ask questions if you're unfamiliar or unsure of anything. And then, of course, bring your own ideas about how you'd like to build a more inclusive workplace. like most things, I would say most ERG leadership teams, but then also people working in diversity and inclusion have a lot on their plate. So, make sure that you have also an expectation that, it might take a bit of time to implement something, but most people and groups also have some sort of roadmap or kind of list of things that they're working on. So that's also a great opportunity to ask about maybe some initiatives you could lend your hand to as well. And this last kind of portion here is going to be centered around building a sustainable ERG program. Whether you're leading an ERG or taking part, I think that there's some useful tips here that I've learned at least. One of the most important and impactful things that I've seen is creating an ERG charter document. You can Google, there are lots of different charter documents kind of templates, but the most important things are really just planning out your goals, making sure that there are any plans around, say, events that you want to host in the year, and then also creating a mission statement. You can add some additional things in there as well, but I think those are the main guiding principles. You can always adjust this later on as well, and this should be done on kind of a yearly basis, or at least edited. It's a great way to kind of take a look at where you came from and where you're heading to next. When creating some sort of charter document as well, I also strongly recommend mirroring your company's own means of tracking goals. So, whether you use OKRs or KPIs or something else, looping those in is a great way to kind of show the benefit of ERGs for your leadership teams. You can also tie your ERGs work into company-wide objectives or values. Say one of your company values is team building, just as a general example. ERG work could very easily be linked to various team building initiatives and also kind of fostering that inclusion mindset as well. My next tip for you would be defining ERG roles and responsibilities. Many ERGs have some sort of primary role like a chairperson or a lead, and may have other leaders responsible for specific committees or subgroups. At Unity, we made a very specific decision to have 2 co-chairs as part of our ERG. I was based in Helsinki at the time, and my co-chair, Claire, was based in Vancouver. So that was a 10-hour time difference, but between us, we kind of covered the follow the sun model, which is often used in software development as well, because we had offices in basically the EMEA region, North America, and then also the APAC region. So making sure that we could not only host meetings for our members each month, but then also things like events and other one-off initiatives as well. One other thing that I'd note, just in terms of a very practical thing, is to define an ERG role tenure. So, what is the average length of time for this role? And then also a selection process. Being realistic here, people sometimes leave their jobs for various reasons. So for instance, when I left, we had a kind of handover process that we had already outlined, and then also a clear means of selecting my replacement as well. One thing that's pretty important as well is recruiting an executive sponsor from the organization to support your group's efforts. Essentially, executive sponsors should typically be in the C-suite or some sort of senior management role, and they are essentially the voice of your ERG in conversations at the leadership level. So essentially having someone in the room where you might not be able to kind of voice your own concerns can be a very big help. I would also say, there is no one way to kind of work with your executive sponsors, but in my experience, involving them as much as they're able to do so was a very fruitful way to kind of build that relationship, but then also showcase what we were doing on a more kind of specific and strategic level. In our case, we actually had 2 executive sponsors as well, both at the SVP level at Unity, and both from very different parts of the business. So that enabled us to have a kind of diverse outlook also from the top. ERGs are typically a more grassroots level, but having someone at the kind of top part of the organizational pyramid can be very helpful. One additional tip here, make sure your ERG work is measurable. Working in recruiting, I use data all the time, but specifically in ERG work, ERGs often don't have a huge budget. There's often a question of the impact of their work. So finding ways to measure this is pretty essential and key. This could be as simple as starting with ERG membership. Like say you start an ERG, you have 12 members. Maybe you set a goal that you want to increase membership by a certain percentage. You could also look at things like engagement at meetings, who's speaking, should we adjust our meeting structure to allow people more time for conversation or other things. And then of course, events as well. Whether you're hosting an event for your own ERG or an ERG event hosted by your ERG, but open to the entire company, noting how many people attend those events is a great way to make a case for more budget, especially if you're doing things like ordering food or bringing in an external vendor. Track the time you spend working on ERG initiatives. This is a pretty big one, I think, for my own case. I was not in a position where I had time to do ERG work during the workday. This has changed a little bit now that I've heard at Unity at least. But basically, tracking the time you spend also helps you make a case, for more leads in your group, maybe some sort of compensation, or to get other volunteers or other people who can support things like events. Big fan of delegating in general, especially with events kind of logistics. And it's a great way to involve more people at your organization. If you do have a budget as well, if you're in that fortuitous situation, also making sure that you keep track of how you spend your money and leverage this information for future budgetary discussions. Typically, if you have a budget, you need to use it or lose it, so they say. So making sure that you're being very strategic about how you leverage any budget that you have will also help make a case for more budget in the future. Create an ERG specific heritage calendar leading up to each calendar year. If you kind of look at an entire year, there are certain events that various groups celebrate. For instance, June is Pride Month, though we also noticed at Unity that we had so many offices that we could essentially have Pride celebrations almost every month of the year. So being very clear with our members about our strategy about how we were going to celebrate Pride, and also acknowledging those Pride celebrations that might be happening in specific locations was a great way to make sure everyone felt included, and also that we weren't being too centered on one specific month or day. There can also be other days throughout the year that you want to celebrate as well. Maybe there's a company holiday you want to include there, or some sort of other local event. These are great ways to make sure that you can plan your events or initiatives around these dates and also allocate budget for bigger events. For instance, for our employee resource group, we used most of our budget for Pride, but we also planned a pretty big Pride initiative in general, kind of spanning 3 months, just to make sure we were kind of capitalizing on the main Pride events that were happening each year. You can also make a case for recognizing ERG work on top of your role responsibilities. So for instance, including ERG work in performance reviews, essentially you're contributing to company culture, so that should be noted. Potentially allocating specific amounts of time for ERG work as part of your work week, like say you're able to dedicate 5 to 10%, or maybe you have a specific number of hours per month you're able to dedicate, just to make sure that you're being recognized for that, or even making a case for a compensation framework for ERG leaders. I would say this is maybe kind of a later step in the process if you're just starting out, but most larger companies do compensate ERG leads. Maybe not all leadership roles, might be only chairs or specific numbers of leads, but in general, this is actual work. You bring a certain level of expertise, and I firmly believe that you should be compensated for that. The company benefits both in terms of your expertise, but then also the kind of more intangible elements, being able to share something on social media that might kind of relate to employer branding, or maybe you propose a change to a benefit which is rolled out on a global level. These are all things that are kind of exemplative of your own expertise and what you bring to the table. So I know this is a bit of a contentious one, and this is where having a diversity inclusion team can be very helpful for having these conversations, or having an executive sponsor, or ideally both. But in general, keeping in mind, your impact and being able to showcase what you've done is a great way to make a case for this as well. One thing that I also noticed in my time at Unity is that collaborating with other ERGs was a kind of life-changing experience in some ways. Being able to really kind of bond with other people who might be from a very different background or group, but then also collaborating was a great way to build those connections and also make some friends along the way as well. On a very practical level, if you collaborate on events, you can often share budget. So for instance, if you have 2 or 3 ERGs working on some sort of event, that already means that you're pooling multiple resources. You can also share the responsibilities of those events, so things often move very smoothly. We got to a point before I left Unity where we had so many different collaborative events happening between ERGs. And it was really great to see the different kind of focus areas and things that our groups thought up. This can also mean bolstering member engagement for both or all collaborative ERGs, and also provide opportunities to meet other people throughout the organization. I just spoke about my experience meeting other ERG leads, but that can also be true for your members or allies who might want to attend an event as well. And leadership meetings, which include all ERG leaders. So, we had our own LGBTQ plus ERG meetings about our own strategy, but then having an all ERG lead strategy also helped to build understanding about each group's successes and areas where certain groups may have needed help. We also had a shared heritage calendar, so we can make sure that we weren't double booking events on certain days. So it's really just, a very practical way to make sure you're not kind of duplicating work in some instances, and also could even mean making a bigger case to your leadership team if there's something that all ERGs could benefit from that you don't currently have. And my last point here, and this is a pretty important one, I think, take time for your mental and physical health and well-being. ERG work is, or at least in my experience, can be quite tiring, quite draining, mostly because I cared a lot about the work that we were doing. And also as a member of the LGBTQ plus community myself, it can be a bit difficult sometimes to kind of separate the ERG self that you must bring and your personal self. I think you can find a way, most people do, but part of that also meant understanding, when I needed a break, or, having a co-chair was a really great way to make sure that I was able to step back sometimes, especially in particularly busy times of the year with recruiting. At Unity, we kind of worked on a quarterly basis. So, at the beginning of each quarter, I had many roles to open. So making sure that that was kind of transparent and accounted for was one way that I was able to kind of make sure that I was building a sustainable approach to ERG work for myself, but then also supporting our entire community as well. So we've kind of walked through the basics of ERGs. We talked a bit about the benefits, and then I've talked kind of ad nauseum here about how I believe you can build a sustainable ERG program. So that's about all that I have. Feel free to contact me on LinkedIn if you have any questions after this. But I guess at this point, we will move to the Q&A session. And just one last thing here, there are some resources here that I've kind of referenced in this talk, but also things that I look to just as general resources for myself. So I'll stop sharing my screen then. And I know there are some questions here.
Yes, we've gotten a few questions in the chat, and then I have some additional ones on my own part.
Amazing.
Yes, so thank you for the presentation. It was really helpful. I have to admit that I personally don't have a whole lot of experience with ERGs. Like, I know the concept basically, but the particulars have been something that I haven't yet fully grasped. One of the things that I wanted to ask you is, since your background is primarily in pretty large organizations, do you feel like there is a specific sort of limit for how many employees you need to have in order for it to make sense to get started with ERGs?
That's a very good question. And also something that when putting together this presentation, I don't have a kind of yes or no answer or like a specific number. I think that ERGs tend to grow and evolve as the organization does as well. If you notice that, in tech, oftentimes there are very few women in an organization. That is changing, of course, but, that's maybe one example where having a smaller number but very dedicated members can be a great way to make a case for additional resources or things like that. I don't think that there's necessarily an ideal number, but in larger organizations, I think some of the challenges are felt across the organization in a different way than, if you work in a 100-person growth company, maybe everyone sits on one floor of a building. It's a little bit of a different experience in that sense. I would say the other thing here that you didn't ask about, but which I think is also very important to note, is that if you don't have a leadership team that is bought into the concept of D&I or employee resource groups, that might be a bit of a barrier when establishing a group. So in a larger organization, strength in numbers kind of rings true there. But I think if you're part of an underrepresented group, or maybe you are an ally and would like to help other groups, there might be enough of a case for you to kind of come together and kind of explain the benefits of creating ERGs as well.
Thank you. Actually, kind of related to that. So one of the things that people ask here in the chat is whether you think ERG should be global or local.
This is something that we talked a lot about at Unity as well. So, when it comes to things like budgetary decisions, it's a lot easier for finance to say, okay, you have 9 ERGs, here is a budget for 9 groups, rather than, different groups that might be split between 3 different countries or cities or what have you. I think that at least what we tried to do is balance kind of global programming with local programming. Especially with volunteering with local groups. That's a great way to involve your local community, and then also kind of come to the larger group and share your findings. We also tried to plan events that were inclusive of at least 2 different major time zones. So for instance, with the EMEA region and then also with the APAC region and so forth. But I also think it's a great way for you to celebrate local nuances as well. Maybe there's some sort of celebration in one location that another location might not know about. So it's a great way to kind of build those connections and kind of share a bit about your own perspective with the larger group. I personally am a big fan of the global approach just because it helps you to maximize, building relationships across, borders, but then also time zones and so forth as well.
That makes a lot of sense. One thing that I personally can think about where I think having local groups makes sense is if it's, for example, for foreigners in that country, because then, obviously it might be difficult to relate between different countries about how things work in a specific location. So.
On the converse of that, it might mean that you have lots to talk about in terms of the differences, but then also similarities
also true.
As well.
Yeah. Also true. But like, for example, if you have issues with, for example, how to file your taxes, the people in a different country might not be able to help you with that.
That is very true. I would say accountants are probably the best way forward, but that's my own own perspective on taxes.
Yeah. So one of the things that you mentioned is getting buy-in from as high up from the organization as you can for starting the ERG. So to understand a little bit better, so why do you think that you need, kind of playing devil's advocate here, like, do you need employees or the employer's approval for starting an ERG, or like, couldn't you basically just like be like, okay, we have a group of people who with a similar background and we start meeting informally? Does the company need to know about that?
I don't think that they need to know, but I think, when it comes to, say, making a case for a budget, you very much do need their buy-in to kind of make sure that they allocate that budget accordingly. I think, starting informally is a really great way to kind of build that capacity and understand the strengths of the group that you have. That way you can kind of map out, what you would like your first steps to be. Is it holding a meeting monthly? Like, that's a really great first step. You don't really need anyone's approval for that. If the group is seen as somehow exclusionary, which I have seen happen in smaller companies, that might be a case where you do need to loop in someone else in the organization. But it could be, so much as looping in someone from HR. They might have a bit of context from their own experience working in HR. Typically, diversity and inclusion teams sit within the HR function or the people function somewhere. So, there might be some synergy there that can help to kind of build the case in a more strategic way in that sense. But, in terms of just, meeting people who might have a similar experience or allies that might want to, support with a similar experience, I think you can start with whatever you've got. And oftentimes that's, not much in terms of budget, at least. But lots of people power on that side.
What do you think? Like in a way, like wouldn't it be more authentic for the initiative to come from the employees, even if it then ends up becoming like an official group? Because one thing that I'm also wondering is like, well, is it possible that, for example, if the initiative comes from HR, are people actually willing to join? Is there enough buy-in for the people who would benefit from the ERG?
I think that ERG should always come from the employees. HR can help to, maybe add some structure. Even if you take a diversity and inclusion team, for example, they're still on kind of the employer side in that sense. So they play a slightly different role, still a very expert role. But, if I take the case of Unity, we started with a handful of ERGs, and essentially employees themselves said, hey, I would like to create an ERG for this specific group. For instance, we had a veterans ERG that was proposed, and I believe is now up and running as well. And that's something that wasn't part of our initial run of ERGs. I wasn't there for the very initial stages of Unity's ERG forming process. I was part of the first formal leadership team, but I know that the kind of process started years before that. So, again, very grassroots kind of communications based, trying to find connections or people that might think that this would be a worthwhile investment of time and energy. I definitely agree that, if it came from HR, it might be a little bit less authentic. Though, there could also be cases where maybe there isn't someone who is able to step in and lead that ERG, and maybe someone is an ally who, does have the capacity or the resources or the experience that would be able to help. So, I think that there's no kind of one way to establish an ERG. And I think working with what you have is a great starting point.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And speaking about allies, one of the questions that have come up from several people in the chat that I was also wondering myself is like, do you feel like ERG should be open to everyone, including allies or people who don't necessarily belong to the specific minority that's being supported, or should it be limited to the representatives of that minority to make it more of a safe space? What do you think about that?
This is something that we talked about at length is at Unity. I've also seen it done in different ways at different companies. For instance, some companies might have both a public channel, which anyone can join, and then also a private channel. If you use a tool like Slack, for example. It is a bit tricky though, because then, I believe that we should not police people's identity. So for instance, maybe you're not like using a queer person as an example, maybe you're not an out queer person. That immediately poses a very complicated question about, are you assumed to be queer just because you join this organ or this group specifically? I think that an important thing to note is creating some sort of ground rules that can inform, how you behave within that group. For instance, if there's inappropriate comments or conduct, that should be kind of covered before someone joins. Oftentimes, these things are already covered by a code of conduct or something similar. But if you have specific requests for groups like, don't spam this channel with, advertisements for a different event or something like that, I think that that's also important to call out. But I personally believe that allies should be involved. I think that, it's a great way. Myself, I'm not a Black person, but if there is a Black ERG, I would love to support their events. If there is another ERG, let's say a neurodivergent ERG or some sort of accessibility ERG, I would love to join and support that work as well. I think that it really takes kind of an open channel of communication between ERG leads to kind of build that level of understanding. But then from there, just making sure that you're clear about your messaging and who's invited to participate, both in terms of, if you have regular meetings, but then also things like events and so forth.
Yeah, I think those are good points. What do you think about like, how do you then make sure that the allies don't take over a specific kind of, say, for example, if it's for racial minorities such as Black or Asian, then maybe you don't feel as safe if there's too many white people in it, even if they're supportive, but like they still can't necessarily relate to your experience. Because like I'm asking because like I've noticed personally, for example, that the DEI scene in Finland at least is very much dominated by white women, such as myself. So it can also feel sort of non-inclusive, even though it's supposed to be inclusive.
Yeah, I think this is also where, for instance, if you have an ERG leadership team, they typically come up with programming. They might take comments from the group themselves. I think that there is kind of a very fine line there in terms of supporting versus dominating a conversation. I would say, and this is something that I haven't fully experienced, like I'll be honest, my experience with Unity's ERGs is quite positive in general on this front. But I think that also speaks to Unity's company culture in terms of having people who are genuinely invested in wanting to improve things. But I think if you kind of set some sort of ground rules in terms of who's able to speak, maybe you raise your hand on Zoom. But then also if you have specific feedback for someone, covering that in private and in a way that's considerate of their kind of effort and time, but then also acknowledges the needs of the group, I think is probably the best way forward there. It's a very valid concern. And I think in most cases, at least in my experience, people have been very respectful in employee resource group settings. It is a very kind of small group. It's something that is in many cases a privilege to have. So at least I've seen that, time and kind of experience have been respected in that way.
Yeah. Hopefully, usually that is the case.
Yeah.
Sometimes you always have outliers.
Yeah, I mean, if there isn't, then I think that that's a great opportunity for you to discuss, with the ERG leadership team about, how to handle actions like this. I personally believe in a restorative justice approach in pretty much every scenario. So just making sure that, people understand the intent and also the needs of the group, I think. Exactly. And from there, you can kind of, build an approach from there.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. What kind of pitfalls do you see when someone starts establishing an ERG, like from the ground up? What do you think that could go wrong potentially?
One, and this also comes from my experience in Finland as well, working with NGOs. There are sometimes people who want to start an ERG just because they want to be known as the person who starts the ERG. I think most people are pretty, genuine in their intent to want to get involved with employee resource groups, but that's one potential that I could see. Having a tenure for an ERG leads type group would essentially account for, someone who might not be able to kind of lead the group in a way that people feel, corresponds with what the group's mission or goals are. I think one on a personal level, as I mentioned, taking into account your own mental and physical health is very important. If you overexert yourself very early on, that's one very common pitfall, I would say, within the kind of DEI sector in general. I think, there are various examples that I could give, but most of them are quite small. So I think just being aware that, you might make mistakes, but also keeping in mind that you are an expert in your own experience, not someone else's experience. So also being open to feedback, I think, is a great way to make sure that if there are pitfalls, you can learn from them and then hopefully incorporate that into your future strategy. I don't think anyone expects ERGs to be a perfect representation of an ideal type of minority. I think that would be a very slippery slope to kind of go along. But in my experience, most people have been very open. If there was feedback to be given, it was given in a way that made sense, I think, and also allowed for growth and also opportunities for change. So I don't want to paint too rosy of a picture here. I think that it's a very valid question, but I think just being very realistic and open to feedback is a great starting point to make sure that that's accounted for.
Yeah. And I think you make a good point there, especially with like overexerting yourself. Like that often tends to be the case, like when you get started with some sort of any kind of a volunteer organization, is that like when you get started, everyone's really excited and like, let's do this and let's do that. And that's do this, and
Exactly.
especially when you're doing it on the side of your full-time job, quite often what happens is that then, well, people start dropping out and like, okay, I don't actually have the capacity to be doing this.
Exactly.
So, yeah, I think it's important to make sure that you distribute tasks evenly already from the get-go. So
yeah, maybe one other one is, starting your measurement of ERG activities early on. That's a really great way to make sure that, if you're trying to make a case for a budget, you already have those things, at the ready for any person who might be a decision maker about a budget, or, approval for an event or something else where, you might need someone's sign off. It's not necessarily a pitfall, but it is something that we didn't do initially as part of our ERG group because we had so many different things that were going on. But I think being very measured with it, being very intentional about how you track, retention and things like that can be a huge, huge thing to then look back on as well.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point as well. What kind of activities or engagement can you actually do? Like talking on a very like practical level, like what kind of things can you do with an ERG? Like does everything need to be focused around like how do you cope with being a minority in the company, or what kind of things can you do?
I would say that you can essentially do whatever you'd like in terms of things that would be beneficial for your members. At Unity, we started with 3 main kind of committees that we had within each ERG, but this could, be expanded and changed as to your own group's needs. So we had one committee focused on recruitment and retention. We had one focused on professional development and one focused on community engagement. These don't necessarily center around LGBTQ plus identity at all. So they're very practical things. I really leaned into the recruiting side just based on my own experience as a recruiter. I found that our groups were very unfamiliar with our own internal mobility processes and things like that. So really just making sure people understood like, hey, there are all these resources here. This is where you find them. If you have questions or if this seems confusing or scary, you can always come to me directly and then we can talk about it. So just really kind of demystifying some of these things that exist in corporate culture, I think is a really great starting point. Also things like having conversations about, maybe you're up for promotion or maybe you're trying to move into a different type of role. It's great just to have a group of people that you can talk about these things with. And then also celebrate the successes as well. I think that that's a really great one. It doesn't necessarily have to be related to your identity at all, but knowing that you have a group of people who might share an identity or might be, are potentially allies of who you are as a person is a really impactful and potentially life-changing thing for some people. Like I helped a few people navigate their internal mobility processes. I was not the recruiters for a different part of the business, but just kind of helping them understand what the process entails and what their options were. For instance, one thing that was kind of confusing for people at certain points was when you have to inform your manager if you're going through an internal interview process. That if you don't have a great relationship with your manager, that could be a very tenuous and very tense situation. So just, being very, very specific, like you do not have to inform them until this point, gave people a lot of mental clarity. But then in terms of events, you can also take notes from your community. Like, we planned Pride events that weren't necessarily just like all drag queens and glitter. We were very, very, very intentional about that. And we wanted to make sure that we were giving back to the community, that we were accounting for intersectionality when planning our events as well, partnering with other ERGs to make sure that we could highlight, members of their groups and maybe some things that their groups were interested in. And in general, just kind of finding interesting ways to engage with the community. And this could be, bringing in external speakers, for example, or maybe there's an executive or someone within the company who you find inspiring who isn't part of your group, but could just kind of provide some insights into their own experience. How did you become a vice president of something? Like that's something most people don't do, and it could potentially be a very interesting conversation regardless of that person's identity. So I think there are lots of different options. I'm really great at coming up with ideas that are free just because I haven't always had budget in my organizations I've worked with or with our ERGs. So I think the more creative you get, the more engaging it can be.
Yeah, How active do you think that ERGs should be to become successful, like in terms of like time spent, or how often do you organize something or communication wise?
So this is where I would again kind of throw back to the charter discussion. In an ERG charter, you typically set very specific goals. So like
Mhm.
say you want to boost retention by a certain percentage, or you want to organize a certain number of events. That's a really great way to define your own measurements of success. Because there is no done, so to speak. So it's better to have a measurable way that you can kind of reflect on activities that you've done. I would say having a consistent format for a charter across ERGs helps you understand how your ERG is doing compared to another ERG at your organization. But with that as well, you can also pull resources, you can pull time, responsibility, all these sorts of things. For our ERG, we were really focused on boosting membership across all the regions where we had offices,
Mhm.
which is not an easy task when you have over 40 offices. So that was something that we felt was one of the most important things that we could work on, really just to kind of boost our own kind of internal participation. But then from there as well, making a case for more budget. We spent all of our budget. So, maybe a goal is spending all of your budget. That's already a really great goal. Sometimes it can be very difficult to do so, especially because if you work with, vendors that are also, let's say, interested in your group's focus area, they might donate things, which is great, but then you also have to find new ways to spend that budget. So there are nuances to kind of determining what success looks like. But I think if you kind of throw back to your charter and kind of stick to that, you can understand how far you've come as an ERG, and then also report on it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We still have time for a few more questions. I have two more on my side. So for those of you still watching, if you have any questions, now's the time to either raise your hand or type it in the chat. But in the meantime, so one of the questions that came up in the discussion here is, how would you sell the idea of starting ERGs to management? Because you said that it's really important to have management buy-in. How would you get started with that? Like if as an employee you feel like, okay, I want to start an ERG for LGBTQ people, for example, how would you get started with that discussion with your manager?
So I would start by linking to any sort of company goals. I think that's a really great way to so kind of speak the language of the people who might make decisions about some of these things. So like if you have a goal to, I don't know, convert X amount of customers, maybe that there are some customers that would be sympathetic to your ERG's cause. That might help to sway customers that might be on the fence if you can showcase your own company values in that way. You can also link to your company values, for example. So most companies have some sort of value around teamwork or something like that. This is a very great way to kind of showcase that, by making sure we're more inclusive of people who, might be a marginalized or underrepresented group, we can help them feel more included, and then might perform more strongly as a team. There are also tons of research articles out there about how diverse teams outperform homogenous teams. So quick Google can sometimes really help pull some facts and figures that you can incorporate into that pitch. Whether it's specific to your group or just diversity and inclusion in general.
Mhm.
If you're working at a smaller company, you probably have to have a different strategy than you would at a larger company,
Mhm.
specifically around diversity and inclusion. I don't think most companies have a diversity and inclusion specialist if they're under 100
Mhm.
people. If
Yeah.
you do, great, that's amazing, and I would love to work where you work.
Uh,
But I think in general, I think it's a process as well. So, if you find that you're not successful the first time around, you could also, follow up in 3 months or ask for feedback as
mhm.
well. I understand, this person might not be interested now. What can you
Mhm.
do to help sway them down the line? What sort of things are they looking for or would be important to them?
Mhm.
Um, I think that you can kind of play both sides, so to speak, in terms of your own group's agenda, but then also try to help make a case and situate it within your own company context, whatever that might be.
What would you do, like, if you find that leadership is really against forming any ERGs for some reason, and no matter whatever points you give them, they don't want to? What would you do in that case? Would you just like start a rogue group, or then just continue trying to get through them?
I mean, I think if you're having that discussion, you've probably already started a rogue group in many cases. So I think pooling your resources there could be helpful, but oftentimes it might be helpful just to mention, other companies that have groups themselves. So, what are the competitors doing? What is typical for the market? I've also heard the argument, well, we're not trying to be like the other companies. Okay, well then what can we do to be even better than them? Like try to turn it in that direction. I think sometimes their leadership can be a bit naive, might be the wrong words, or just unaware of the needs of their employees. So, having a tangible case, we have this number of people who would be in support of this. It doesn't require budget at this stage. It doesn't require working time. You can showcase different ways that this will not necessarily detract from the company work, but also add to it on top of things that are already being done. And then, there are a whole list of things that, can be benefited from employee resource group activity, which I mentioned in the benefits part of my presentation. But then, also things like, what's happening on the pulse surveys? Are there pulse surveys or engagement surveys? Are people happy? Are people leaving the company? You might be able to reference some of these other things that happen within companies and potentially showcase ways that by having employee resource groups, you can make a case to kind of help with those efforts. Retention is a huge question in tech always, especially in recruitment. Anytime someone leaves, you oftentimes have to backfill those roles. Or nowadays with so many layoffs happening, maybe you won't get budget for a backfill for a person. So then what happens? How do you maintain that company culture in that way? So I don't think there's like a neat answer. I think, sometimes the answer might be leaving an organization, which is unfortunate, but, that's what I've seen happen in certain cases as well. Also in my own experience, finding that I'm not feeling welcomed at a particular organization might be, a way to show me that I should start looking for something else externally. Yeah. Hopefully you don't get to that point, but, could be an option to explore if you haven't.
Yeah. What kind of arguments would you use, like if the reason that leadership was against starting any ERGs wasn't time or money, but it was because, well, that's exclusive towards others? Is like, why would we start a group that only includes a certain kind of employee? Like, isn't that going to make other people feel like they're not included in like, maybe they feel like they're being left out? So how would you argue that kind of a deal? That's
one of the more difficult kind of cases that I haven't found a silver bullet to kind of navigate that discussion. I think, situating within context, like historical context, especially of historically underrepresented and marginalized groups, is one way to hopefully make that case. Maybe finding external parties or someone in some sort of leadership role, whether it's at the C-suite level or people manager or director or someone else who's sympathetic to the cause, might be a way to kind of help build a case for an argument. But I'll be very honest with you, it's a very challenging discussion. It's worthwhile to have, but it's one that I think, and this is where that persistence piece that I mentioned comes into play. Sometimes you just have to chip away at it over time, and hopefully you'll make some progress. This is also where I think, determining what success looks like is very important. Also for your own, well-being, right? Like, you can't change the world in one day, and you can't do it by yourself. But I think being very clear about your intentions, what you hope to accomplish, and then also just being persistent with it is I think the best starting point. Leveraging any data you have, whether it's Glassdoor reviews, maybe it's employee surveys, maybe it's, if you work in recruiting, maybe it's some sort of candidate experience survey. Any data sources you have that could illustrate your points could help, eventually change the mindset of some of these folks. But it is a battle in some cases. Yep. And I acknowledge that, I recognize it, and also commend anyone who's working through that, because it's not easy, but I firmly believe that it's worthwhile.
Well, thank you very much. I think that was very good. I hope all of you online have also enjoyed this. It looks like we don't have any additional questions, so I think we can wrap up a little bit ahead of time. So thank you everyone for joining. As mentioned in the beginning, we will be hosting an in-person after-work drink session to discuss thoughts on the upcoming elections and the future you would like to see in Finland. If you're based in or around Helsinki, come and join us on Wednesday, the 29th of March from 5 p.m. onwards. The information is also currently posted in the chat and will be posted also on our LinkedIn and our Slack channels soon. I've also posted a link for our Slack. If you're interested in joining our Slack discussions, you are more than welcome to. And please also introduce yourself in our introduction channel if you joined. It currently looks like there aren't a lot of introductions, but that's just because it deletes the older messages because we use Slack for free. We are a nonprofit organization with very limited or zero budget resources. So, but thank you so much, Austin. That was really helpful. I personally learned so much more about ERGs than I knew before, and I'm sure our audience did too. So thanks everyone, and have a good Thursday night.
Thanks for having me.